Welcome to the webinar covering the ecology and conservation of bumblebees, co-hosted by the Xerces Society and our partners at the University of Minnesota. Really excited to go learn about bumblebees together today. Just some technology things up front. You can use the chat to speak to each other or generally say whatever you want, but we encourage you to use the Q&A function to actually ask questions. There will be two 10-minute Q&A sessions where we'll verbally answer some questions, but also we will be actively in the Q&A session answering them by typing them out. Also note that you have a closed caption option available for this meeting, so you should be able to see somewhere on your screen 3 little dots. If you click on that, it'll give you the option to enable closed captioning so that you can see a transcript of this. And please note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available later for at your own pace viewing. And with that, I will let our first speaker get started.
Great, thanks, Laurie. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Lamke. I'm a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society. I'm based in Lincoln, Nebraska, and run the Atlas projects in Nebraska, Missouri, North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, and we'll be helping out with our new efforts in Iowa and playing a small role in Minnesota as well. So thanks everyone for being here. I saw a lot of Iowa people pop into the chat, so excited to get that project going this year. I'm gonna start off with a brief intro to pollinators today and talk a little bit about their ecology, and then I'll be handing it off to Elaine. So if you haven't heard of the Xerces Society before, we are a science-based nonprofit organization that works to conserve invertebrates as well as the habitat that supports them. We're named for the now extinct Xerces blue butterfly. I know the name is sort of hard for a lot of people to want to even try and pronounce, but if you know that it's named after a butterfly, sometimes that makes it a little easier. If you ever want to find resources from us or follow along with our work, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We have a blog, many webinars on YouTube, all available to you. And we work to conserve invertebrates because they make up 95% of the biodiversity known on Earth. So when we think about all the different kinds of plants and mammals, fungi, birds, all the living things out there, 95% of those different species are some type of invertebrate. They exist in nearly all ecosystems, and most of them, I think about only 2% are considered pests, but the other 98% have a beneficial role either to us or to the ecosystem. So they help with things like decomposition, biocontrol. They serve as the base of many types of food chains, and particular to today's focus, they supply pollination services. So today we're going to learn a little bit about pollinators, but we're mostly going to be focusing in on bumblebees. And the importance of pollinators, one of the biggest things is their pollination services, right? They're a huge help in maintaining diverse plant communities. So on the screen here, I have a picture of some common Great Plains prairie plants, and you can see that their roots go deep down into the system. And these roots are helping to cycle nutrients in the soil and provide stability, and the vegetation above ground is capturing carbon, filtering out water. And about 85% of flowering plants require an animal for reproduction, right? So most times that animal that's doing the pollination is an insect. And having these diverse plant communities really helps the ecosystem deal better with disturbance or disruption and create a more resilient environment. But the support from those pollinators extends beyond helping the plants produce, right? Those plants are going to go on to provide fruits and seeds from many different kinds of animals. Pollinators themselves serve as a huge source of food for many of our songbirds. And as we go up the food chain, animals like bobcats, grizzly bears, cougars are also going to be feeding on those animals that are feeding on the plants. So thinking about all of the connections in nature, pollinators are a very integral source to maintaining that healthy diversity. And for that reason, we consider pollinators to be a keystone species. which is an organism that has a disproportionately large role in their environment. So if we think about pollinators being removed from this earth, it would look drastically different than what we know it as today. And when we talk about pollinators, the main groups of insect pollinators include species like butterflies, flies, moths, wasps, beetles, but most of us know about bees as a pollinator, and that's because they're the most effective one. So even if you know bees as the pollinator, hopefully you'll learn something today as to why they're the best pollinator. So bees are the only insect to consume nectar and pollen throughout their entire life cycle. So as a small larvae all the way to the adult stage, nectar and pollen is a bee's main source of food, right? That's the only thing that they can survive on. And because of that, they've evolved these structures to collect and transport pollen back to their nest. So here we have a picture of a bumblebee, and on its hind leg, what we're looking at is the corbicula, or the pollen basket, which is essentially a groove on their hind leg with these large hairs on the side that the bees will pack full of pollen when they're out foraging. So they then can fly back to their nest, be pretty balanced because both of their hind legs have these saddlebags on them that are just packed full of pollen. And lastly, bees exhibit what we call flower constancy, which is their tendency to visit the same type of flower when on a foraging bout. So as a bee leaves its nest, say it's presented with a field that's got roses and daisies and mint flowers, the bee is likely going to go to the same mint flower, visit another mint flower, visit another mint flower, and then head back to its nest. And there's a few different reasons for that, at least that we think. One of those is it's more efficient for the bee, right? So each different type of flower that a bee visits, it has to learn how to handle that flower, how to manipulate it to get the nectar and get the pollen from that plant. So visiting the same type of flower cuts down that handling time for the bee. It also deposits pollen onto the appropriate flower because those flowers need the same type of pollen to reproduce. And when most of us think of bees, although this might be changing, a lot of us think of honeybees, right? They are an object of familiarity to us. They're a staple of our current agricultural system. It's a fun hobby to get involved in. We can learn a lot from honeybees, but they are considered livestock, right? So they are a non-native species that is managed by humans, transported around the country in some cases. And these are not the species that we're going to be talking about today. So I have a poll here. It's going to launch up on your screen. You want to take a second and answer this question. How many different species of wild native bees are found in the United States? So far, it's appearing that we have a pretty well-informed crowd here today. All right, we'll give you a few more seconds. Looks like 75% of people have participated. Okay, so if you guessed between 2,000 and 4,000, you are correct. In the United States, there are about 3,600 species that we know of. And worldwide, there are 20,000. There are likely many more species that we just don't know of yet, waiting to be discovered. And a lot of these species have a variety of life histories. They come in many different colors. They have different ranges of where they can be found, different lengths of time that they'll be out on the landscape. They have different strategies for collecting pollen. 70% of our wild bees nest below ground. Many of our species are solitary, so they're different from honeybees in that there is not sort of that case system of the queen, workers, and males, right? A solitary bee will sort of do all of the work of the colony, but on her own. So here's another question. So of the 3,600 wild bees in the US, how many of those are bumblebees? All right, well, I'm glad to see we're going to learn something here. Okay, so in the United States, there are only about 47 species of bumblebees. So if you guessed between 20 and 50, good job, hats off to you. It would be amazing if there were 1,000 species of bumblebees in the US, but our job would be a little bit more overwhelming, that's for sure. So today, as I said, we're going to be focusing on bumblebees. So here's a huge, lovely pie chart that sort of represents all the different kinds of bees that we can find in the United States. And for bumblebees, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not. We are going to be looking right here. Just this small sliver today is what we're going to be talking about. So keep in mind, as we're talking about all these wonderful, cool things that we're going to learn about today, it's only a very, very small amount of wild bees that you can find in the US. And when you're thinking about pollination services in many of our natural areas, even in our urban areas, our backyards, our parks, it's these species that are doing a lot of the pollination, right? So not the honeybees, they are super important for agriculture. They are in some of our backyards, but it's mostly our wild bees that are taking care of the pollination services for us. So going into the value of bumblebees, there's a few ways that we can separate out how bumblebees are valuable from some of the other species that we can find. And it comes down to these 4 characteristics here: their physiology, their intelligence, their tongue length, and then their ability to pry open flowers and use their strength. So the first one, looking at their physiology, bumblebees are a relatively large species, and within their thorax, which is the middle part of the bee where their wings attach and their legs attach, they have 2 pairs of muscles that are sort of expanding and contracting in sync with each other. And what that's doing is pulling the thorax up and down, which causes the wings to move up and down. But bumblebees have the ability to sort of turn off their wings and just generate that muscle power. Sort of like how we shiver, our muscles generate heat. Bumblebees are able to do the same thing. So this allows them to fly in cooler temperatures, maybe slightly wetter temperatures, when other bees just can't handle that environment. And again, related to their ability to shiver and use their muscles, bumblebees can use that same motion to buzz pollinate flowers. And so there are certain plants like tomatoes, peppers, blueberries that have what are called poricidal anthers. On the screen here, you can see them. They're the yellow parts on the flower, and they hold pollen grains very tightly within them. And in order for those pollen grains to be dislodged and taken out of the flower, they need some sort of vibration. So here on the screen, you can see the bumblebee is grasping one of those anthers and shaking it so vigorously that pollen is flying out of the end there. You can see that there's very tiny little like fairy dust particles coming out of the flower. And not all bees can do this. So again, this is a trick of the bumblebee and a few other species out there. When we look at buzz pollination, about 8% of flowers can actually benefit this. So while a lot of people don't think of tomatoes necessarily needing pollinators, native bees can actually significantly increase the amount of fruit that's produced from them. And that's why you can find like tuning forks available at garden stores, right? Because if you go in your tomato plants, you're going to be helping them out. So You could also just provide habitat and invite some bumblebees into your yard, do the same thing. Tongue length is a way that we categorize bee species. So there are short-tongued bees. Bumblebees as a whole are considered long-tongued bees. And you can see on the screen here, get my cursor. You can see this right here. This is the tongue of a bumblebee. There's another one. These tongues are probably deep inside these tubes here of the flower. So bumblebees are able to access a wider variety or access nectar from a wider variety of plants because they have the ability to get inside those flowers. Okay, let me turn the spotlight off and we'll move into ecology here. So looking at bumblebee diversity in the US and Canada, and there's about 47 species. On the map here, where you see areas in red, those are where there are many species of bumblebees, and green, there are less species of bumblebees. So they're highest in those western montane regions. Bumblebees are fit for cooler climates, so as we go up in elevation, we're creating more niches for different species to coexist. The states listed on the screen here are current Atlas projects, except Iowa. Iowa's not on this one here, I'm sorry. But you can see that throughout the different states, these numbers of species vary. And, you know, for a state like South Dakota that has a lot of green in it, it also has a red patch there of high diversity. So some of the states that have both eastern species and western species, it's kind of a nice place to be. So if you're in Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, you kind of get a mix going on there. Looking at the colony, so bumblebees are social colonies similar to honeybees. There's a queen, there are worker bees. The worker caste is all female, and then there are male bees, and bumblebees run on an annual life cycle, meaning that they are going to be active for 1 year, and they will be founded by a new queen each year. Depending on the species, the quality and quantity of resources, climate conditions, a colony can contain anywhere from 25 to 1,000 workers at its peak. And they tend to nest somewhere that has some pre-existing insulation, right? Some sort of cavity that's just ready for them to go and set up shop. Oftentimes that's an abandoned rodent burrow, a nice clump of bunch grasses, unmowed or unmanaged areas that are just kind of messy looking. Sometimes it'll be in bird boxes, or if there's an old barn with exposed insulation, they will definitely take advantage of that as well. When we look at the life cycle of a bee, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks to go from an egg all the way to an adult bee. The eggs there, you can see the picture, they look like tiny grains of rice when they're laid, and they're all laid by the queen. Those eggs will eventually hatch into larvae, and those larvae will sort of go through successive stages where they'll gradually get bigger, and they'll be feeding on the pollen and nectar or be fed by workers, tended to, making sure that they're nice and clean and everything's all right. Those larvae will then pupate, and the pupa is the phase between the immature and the mature, right? So they're transitioning here. This is when we start to see the development of all those pieces that make us think of a bee. So the wings, the legs, the eyes, the antennae, all of those things start to form. And then the pupae will finally emerge as an adult bee. And once the adult bee emerges, there's no more growing after that. And here I have a picture of the whole life cycle. So the entire year is fit into this one photo here. And the photo goes through all 4 seasons, if you can see that. So we're going to start on the left-hand side in spring, where we can see the queen coming out of hibernation. Where I am in Nebraska, this is happening right now. There have been a few species or a few observations of queens. I know they're coming out in Missouri, so keep your eyes out year in this area. California is way ahead of us. I don't know where Pacific Northwest is, but the queen is going to emerge from hibernation, and she'll spend the next couple of weeks searching for a nice nest location, foraging on any of the early spring resources. You can see down at the bottom, the queen is beginning to build up her wax pots and laid her first few batches of worker bees. Throughout the summer is when you'll see peak colony. So the queen is going to be mostly in the nest at this point, no more foraging for her. She is just focusing on laying eggs. The worker bees are going to take over all the foraging. They're going to be expanding the nest if that's needed. They'll be temperature regulating the nest, defending the nest, tending to the queen and any of her needs. And once the colony reaches that peak and it gets to about late summer, the queen is going to start rearing her reproductive case. So we're going to start seeing males and giants come out, which are new queens for next year. Once those two case members leave the nest, they're going to disperse and mate with members of other colonies. And after mating, the males are going to die off. The new queen is going to return to the nest if there are any remaining workers in there to, capitalize on any remaining food in the nest. But slowly those worker bees that have been active all summer are also going to die off. The founder's queen is also going to die off, and soon the only member of the bumblebee colony left on the landscape will be that newly mated queen. So depending on how many resources are left and how much time she's got left in the season, she'll keep foraging to build up her fat reserves to survive the winter, but then she's going to look for a place to hibernate underground somewhere. And as you'll hear from future presenters, this is a large area of uncertainty where we're still trying to learn a lot about bumblebees. So that's kind of the year of the bumblebee. When this newly mated queen, if she survives throughout the winter all the way to spring, she will start that process all over again. And here's a fun little video of Elaine. So see if that starts playing. This is a nest here. You can see the queen is the large bee in the center, and she's got a few worker bees. And they've got their wax pots in there. So this is obviously a small one, but out in the field, these can get pretty big. And then the last thing that I want to touch on are cuckoo bees. So if anybody is familiar with cuckoo birds or the brown-headed cowbird, it parasitizes the nests of other birds by laying eggs in someone else's nest. There are bees that do the same thing. So cuckoo bees, like the picture in the square here that you can see at the bottom, these bees are built a little bit differently physically. They have a stronger exoskeleton. They've got a thick stinger, so they are made for defense. And these bees try and enter the colony at a very precise moment. So they want the colony to be established at some point. They don't want a whole bunch of workers, because all of those workers would be able to kill the cuckoo bee when she tries to infiltrate the nest. But she wants enough workers present that they'll be able to maintain the nest, do the foraging, and raise her young. So the goal of this cuckoo bee is to infiltrate a nest, kill the existing founder's queen, and take over to lay her own eggs. Sometimes these queens can sort of acquire the nest of the smell, and they'll slowly just live in the nest with the existing queen bee before killing her. But I think there's still a lot to learn about these bees. Interesting life cycle. It's just an advanced level of the bumblebee life cycle. So they're not bad. They are species that we still need to conserve. And I think that's all I've got. I'm going to hand it over to Elaine now.
All right, I'm going to see if I can click and talk at the same time. My name is Elaine Evans. I'm an extension educator and researcher at the University of Minnesota, and partnering with the Xerces Society for the Minnesota Bumble Bee Atlas. And I am going to continue on from Katie talking about some bumblebee ecology. So Katie had mentioned about bumblebees having long tongues, and compared to other bees, they do have long tongues. But I also wanted to point out that that the tongue length varies between the different bumblebee species, and that this is something that's important for shaping their relationships with each other, their relationships with plants. So I have two different bumblebees pictured here, and these their tongues are sticking out here on both of them. So you can see they're both pretty long, but one is quite a bit longer. So tongues on bumblebees can vary from 5 to 12 millimeters in length. So, some have tongues that are over twice as long. And one of the things that happens with that is then the bumblebee community is they're all out getting all their food from flowers, but this way they're able to kind of split up the flowers among themselves, because there's some bees that are better able to use some of those flowers with those longer tubes, floral tubes. So this is something that helps reduce competition between bumblebees. So they kind of split up what they're foraging on. People talk about bumblebees being generalist foragers, which means that they will collect pollen and nectar from a wide variety of flowers. But with this difference in tongue length, that can help determine flowers that they prefer more. So there'll be some bumblebee species that you mostly just see on those flowers with longer tubes. And so part of that is that it is more efficient for the bees with longer tongues to visit those longer tube flowers. This is also a very adaptable trait. So there is one study that was looking at bumblebee tongue length in relation to warming climates, and they were finding in areas where they were seeing warming climates, they were seeing bumblebees with shorter tongues. So this is there's variability out there in the bumblebees, but it is something that changes over time. So I mentioned those the longer tongued bees being more efficient with those deeper flowers. So here's a picture showing what it looks like for one of these long-tongued bees. When they get inside the flower, they're able to get their tongues sticking all the way out, getting to where that nectar is. Whereas the shorter tongued bees tend to be on not on those deeper flowers. And so, why wouldn't all of them have long tongues? If long tongues help them get to more flowers, why wouldn't they all do that? But in looking at what happens when the bees are foraging, the energy output that they have, it actually is more efficient for the longer tongued bees to go to the longer tubed flowers, those short tongued bees to go to the short tubed flowers. So the bumblebees are able to kind of behaviorally specialize on these flowers. They really learn how to be efficient with that flower. They're able to go in quickly and get what they need. And so there's when you're out observing different bumblebee species on flowers, this is something you might notice, seeing, especially once you get to know the different species, noticing certain species, mostly seeing them on some flowers. Another important thing that can happen with short-tongued bees, an interesting behavior that they have, is that sometimes the shorter-tongued bees will get to the long-tubed flowers, but they'll do it by cutting a hole in the base. Sometimes they also just use a hole that somebody else cut. So there's other bees that do this, like carpenter bees, and if there's a hole there, the bee will find it. So this video I'm showing here is a rusty patch bumblebee, which is one of the shorter tongued bees, and they're going around this long tubed bee balm flower, but they're not going in through the proper route, so they're actually not getting a lot of pollen on them. they're not being the greatest pollinators, but they are feeding themselves, and it's an interesting behavior to see how they manage to get nectar from these flowers that would be hard for them to reach. Bumblebees have for their end of the colony cycle, when they're producing those males and the queens, there's a lot of colonies that may not survive to that point where they're actually are able to produce males and queens and reproduce. So one of the things that happens with social colonies is they really only produce reproductives when the colony has been able to bring in enough resources to make new queens, to make males. So this is something that we don't know a lot about in terms of the actual success rates for bumblebees out there in the world. But from observations of colonies, we know that there's a lot of them that end up there's predators that will come and eat them. Sometimes there's not enough resources and they just kind of fizzle out before they do this. But when these colonies are able to build up enough, they will produce the new males and the new queens, and as well as males. The new queens will go out foraging for a bit. So right now we're seeing queens that survive the winter. But again, from midsummer to late summer, you'll see different species of bumblebees the colonies have gotten to the point where they're producing queens. You'll get a chance to see these new queens out on the flowers before they go into hibernation. And the new queens will forage a bit on flowers. They're building up their fat reserves, getting ready for hibernation. And in the mid to late summer, you'll start to see a lot of males out on flowers, and they eventually get kind of booted out of the colony. And so sometimes, especially in the late summer, when it's getting cold, you can look for clumps of these males. These males will find each other out on flowers or out on the grass, and they kind of cluster together. You'll see these piles of them together there. Since they don't have a nest to go back to, they need to try to stay warm. And you'll be able to see bees mating out there too. This is an unusual one, the video that I'm sharing here. Usually it'll just be one male on a female. Sometimes you'll see a couple males on a female. This was something I saw this last summer where there were 6 males that were all glommed onto this one female. So this is a common eastern bumblebee, and there's only likely one male that's successfully mating with her, but everybody else is just kind of glommed on there. So it's something to watch out for in the late summer, when they're out there mating. And so the males, after they've left the nest, they need to find queens to mate with. That's their main mission that the males have, is to mate. This is a slow motion video of this bumblebee. You can see him. This was a male that was perching on this flower. You can see him starting to come back here. There's males that have this behavior where they just perch on a flower, and they have this kind of territory. They have this route that they loop around and fly through. They oftentimes will leave a scent mark on that flower. And a lot of times the males that do this have really huge eyes. So this is one of those species that has these huge eyes. In a second here, you can see a bee came flying through his territory, and he goes taking off after that bee. Hopefully he's able to find a queen that way. There's other ways that males will find queens. There's another behavior called cradle robbing, where the males will just show up at a nest and wait for queens to come out. I have a couple photos here that aren't the best photos, but this was when we were doing observations at a rusty patch bumblebee nest. This is a species for which there's nothing in the literature about what their mating behavior is like. We don't know what the males do, how they find queens, how far they're leaving the nest for mating. And this was only one observation, but we were right out in front of the nest, and we saw males that had come in from other colonies hanging out near the nest, and they zoomed up and grabbed onto the new queens when they came out of the nest. So so that's one of the behaviors that the males will do to find new queens, and one of the behaviors that we're still trying to learn about for a lot of these queens. So I mentioned some of those males will scent mark when they're perching. They'll also sometimes have trails that they'll scent mark with hopefully something that's attractive to the queens. They do find each other. The queens are really highly attractive to the males. They have a different smell, and the males track them down a few different ways. So then for hibernation, I have a video here from some bees we were observing. There's a lot we still have to learn about where different species go. One of the species we know something about is the common eastern bumblebee. They tend to often hibernate near their nest that they came from. So a lot of times there'll be a bunch of queens all in kind of one spot, all digging down in the dirt. So most of the observations that we see from these, they're in loose soil, often on north-facing slopes. And you can see that queen was just digging down into this dirt. They'll just dig themselves down a couple inches and survive the winter there. They do have glycogen antifreeze that they'll have in their blood to keep them from freezing. They have fat stores to help them survive. But we don't know for a lot of species what those habitat associations are. Specifics for most species for what kind of where they're really overwintering, what they're doing. We also don't know a lot about survival rates. So we don't know how much of a stress point this is for bees, for those queens. There's ideas about things changing as climate is changing. There's in some areas there's not as much snow as there used to be through the winter. It wasn't the case in Minnesota this year, where we had lots and lots of extra snow this year. But when that snowpack is thinner, that provides less insulation. These bees may be less able to survive. We do have information on a few species for the temperatures that they can survive to. There is I'm also concerned kind of besides just the lack of insulation, things like the polar vortex that happens because of warm air being pushed up into the poles thanks to climate warming that pushes Arctic air down south. And that's something that can push temperatures below a tolerant level for overwintering queens. One thing, another behavior, notable behavior for bees is nest defense. So these are social bees. They do have that nest is really important, until they get to the point where they're producing those new queens and males. They're not reproducing. They're making lots of workers, but those workers are just building up the colony. It's really important for them to be able to defend that nest, defend their queen, keep that colony going until they can produce new queens. So nest defense is really important. A lot of those other bees those solitary bees tend not to be so defensive, but bumblebees can sting. They do. A lot of this is just happening at the nest. So if you're getting near a nest, they can sting repeatedly. Unlike honeybees who sting once and they have a little hook that hooks into you, they don't do that. They can sting you more than once. Some bumblebees, for defense, not with big mammalian things like us coming at them, but with other things that are coming, smaller, other insects that are coming into their nests. There's some species that will regurgitate honey and just get these things that are trying to come in all sticky and unable to move around. There is a lot of variability in behavior here. So there's some bumblebee colonies that are super gentle and are actually not defensive of their nest at all. So as a bumblebee researcher, I go around and, uh, go look at nests. And sometimes there's nests that need to be moved for one reason or another. And there's some species where I can go in with my bare hands, pick up the entire nest, put it in a box, and they don't care. They don't do anything. They buzz a little bit, but I don't get stung at all. Other species, they would be flying at my face, getting me. So it's important to know the difference, know the behavior, gauge what they're doing if you're gonna do crazy stuff like that, which I don't recommend that you do per se, unless unless you're getting super into it. So a question. So I was just talking about stinging. We have a little poll here. Do males sting? So we were talking about the workers and the queens and the males. So a lot of answers coming in, and people are mostly there. So for bumblebees, for all bees, males are not capable of stinging because they do not have a sting. So the structure of the sting is modified from an ovipositor. So that's something used to lay eggs. That's something that males, a structure that males do not have. So males tend not to really be able to do much for nest defense. I also wanted to talk about some fun stuff with bumblebees, some of the fun behaviors that they have, these complex behaviors that we're still learning about. There have been a series of really cool studies over the past 20 years, really building up, looking at experiments with bumblebees, seeing what they can do, what they can learn. So we have a video here of this bumblebee that was being trained to move a ball into that spot in the center, because that's where it can get the nectar reward. And after it sees how to do it, that bumblebee is able to do it on their own. Another bumblebee that's put in there can watch that bee moving that ball, and they can figure out how to do that themselves. They learn to tell which balls are closest, so they can efficiently just go in and the most quick way for them to get that nectar reward. There are other behaviors other experiments where they've shown them using tools. They've shown that they play, and just in the natural world, we already know they have these complex navigational skills to leave their nests, forage for miles away from their nest, make their way back to these obscure things that are hidden in the ground. So there's, even though they have these tiny brains, they're able to really do much more than people really used to think they could do. We're really a lot of people are expanding their views of what's possible from these tiny brains that that can really still have these complex behaviors, these complex social interactions, things like playing, learning from each other, tool use. There are things that mammals like to use we humans especially, we like to use them to separate ourselves from everything else, but there's really just different ways of being for insects. So I've mentioned a few of the things that we still need to learn more about. There's still for nesting biology. We know generally what bumblebees are doing. We still need to learn a lot specifically about particular species, especially as you'll be learning in the next section about bumblebees of conservation concern. Becomes really important to understand what their habitat needs are, and we have a lot we need to learn still. That hibernation, where they do it, how they're doing, what their survival rate is. Those are still things we need to learn about. How far males and queens disperse from the nest, population densities, things that are going on with reproduction, just males in general, we don't know a lot about. And learning just more about the threats and stressors. And all of these things, all of these different behaviors, information about population, those are all things that you can help us with. So as Atlas volunteers, or just if you're out there observing nature, if you see nests, let us know. If you see interesting behavior, make note of things, take photos, share locations where you're seeing things. Look for queens that are mating, look for queens that are hibernating. There's lots of ways that you can help us fill in these gaps. And with that, I think we have some time for questions.
Many of them were answered for us behind the scenes. So if you type the question into the chat, there's a chance that Rich or Leif or Laurie or Elaine or Elise or myself have answered it. You can go into the answer tab and look, but we can certainly talk through a few of them here.
There is one open question. They were looking for, or someone was looking for examples of aggressive bumblebee species. Elaine mentioned that some of them are quite docile and others of them not so much. I don't know if each of us wants to share an example of a somewhat aggressive species from our different regions.
Yeah, up here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, up here in the Midwest, Bombus fervidus is one of our more aggressive species. An example of a super docile one is Bombus chrysicolis, the brown-belted bumblebee.
I think I would have said Bombus fervidus here too. In fact, I think the name fervidus means like somewhat aggressive or overly enthusiastic or something like that, which I think describes that species quite well. Another species that's calmer here in the Pacific Northwest is Bombus melanopygus, which is a very pretty docile species. You can pick a nest up and actually not get stung.
I'll agree here in California that Bombus fervidus, also called Bombus californicus, is probably relatively more aggressive. And then the other one that you hear or read about is Bombus pennsylvanicus, the American bumblebee, being extra aggressive. I don't have a lot of personal experience with that aggression, but I've read about it.
And I think I was just going to say, I think it's worth noting that both of those species, I believe, are known to nest on the surface of the ground as opposed to underneath the ground. And so there may be some aggressive behavior that's associated with that nesting ecology. Sorry, Katie, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I was going to double up on what Leif said. I don't have experience with the American bumblebee's aggression, but I too have heard that it can be an intimidating species. The other one I think about is the Nevada bumblebee, because I feel like I was telling Rich that I was out surveying one day and there were so many Nevada bumblebees out and they just seemed so curious about what I was doing and so lovely. And that was not the experience that Rich has had. And he said they were slightly more aggressive. So maybe I just stumbled upon the happy colony in Western Nebraska.
Yeah, and there is definitely variability even within a colony where there will be some bees that just have a lower threshold for getting mad at you. So there can be a colony that's mostly calm, but there's just one or two individuals that just they don't like you being there and they come after you.
There's a new question in the chat about, or in the Q&A about whether bees are defensive and aggressive at the nest only or also on flowers. And it was referring to Bombus fervidus in particular. And I'll just clarify that most of the time that you have aggressive interactions with bumblebees, you're near the nest. They're very docile when they're foraging. They'll fly away from you, but they are not likely to show aggression or defensive behavior when they are foraging on flowers.
There was also a follow-up question about nesting on the surface of the ground and what that actually looks like. I must admit I was typing quite avidly while a lot of that presentation was going on, so I'm not sure how much that was covered, but many or most species, it's believed, nest below ground in, say, abandoned rodent burrows. But there are some species that will nest directly on the surface of the ground, and sometimes it's under thatched grasses or under leaf litter or in some sort of insulated ball, but it's not subterranean. It's actually on the surface of the ground somewhere. And it can be quite unkempt. There can be nest cells kind of all over the place. And particularly the American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus, is known to have nests, sort of aggregations on the ground that are quite large, several feet even in diameter. And they can be kind of messy and kind of all over the place. I don't know if anyone else has anything they'd like to add there.
I'll just add that if you do stumble upon a bumblebee nest and you're able to take a picture of it and just observe it for a few seconds, we are actively collecting observations of bumblebee nests. You can submit pictures and some more information to bumblebeewatch.org, and that helps us learn more about the species, what their nest looks like, how active it is, and just advances the science behind that.
We've had several questions about hibernation, so I want to say two quick things about hibernation in answer to some of those questions. Two people have asked about why do they use north-facing slopes for hibernation, and that's often written about, and I think the idea is that the north-facing slope should have less temperature fluctuation daily, and so bumblebees should be able to tell as spring is warming up generally. Gradually, when there's less of this diurnal daily fluctuation. I haven't really, that's something I've read a number of times, but I haven't observed it myself. The second question was, how do we find hibernating bumblebees? And it's very difficult. Most of us rarely, if ever, see this happen. You really have to catch them in the act of digging their burrow. And just to clarify, the hibernation, the hibernaculum, the place that they spend the winter, is a short little tunnel that they dig, and then they just bury themselves. So they pull soil down on top of themselves and spend the winter just like that. So that answers another question about how they close the burrow.
There's a good sort of conservation relevant question in the Q&A that just popped up here, which is, how do we know when we can sort of clear leaves in the springtime? So that we're not disturbing overwintering queens. Really, really great question. Unfortunately, there's no clear, hard and fast answer for this. As I think Elaine and Katie mentioned in their presentations, different species really do emerge at different times of year. Here in the Pacific Northwest and down through California, we have some very early species. Bombus melanopygus is one of them that comes out in February, sometimes in January, and certainly by March. But then we have other species that don't emerge until closer to June. So really just trying to leave some areas of your yard that are truly untouched for a large portion of the year is probably a pretty the best practice. If that's not practicable because of your HOA or other situations, we certainly understand that. In those cases, we typically recommend waiting till at least after St. Patrick's Day. But that really depends on where you live in the country as well. Really waiting until things have warmed up significantly in your area and you've seen actually some bumblebee queens flying around. Once you see that, it's probably okay to start, digging around your garden, as long as it isn't one of those, first early species that emerge. But just to reiterate, this is going to vary widely by geographic area, by elevation, by a number of different things.
Here, so in Minnesota, we generally think about just having, if you have a week where nighttime temperatures are above 50 degrees, that can be a time when it can make more sense. My concern with the leaves is more for other pollinators. So there are moths that are overwintering directly in the leaves. Most of those bumblebees are digging themselves down. So at that video I had was from, there were a whole bunch of queens that were hibernating in an area that I was able to watch last spring. And there was one queen that was just under the leaves. And I was going and checking on the nests, and I checked on her through the fall, where she was not digging herself down into the ground. She was just under just a few oak leaves. And then in the spring, she was dead. I found her there, so I don't, at least in Minnesota, that's not going to be a good strategy. I imagine there might be other places that don't get as harshly cold as us, where maybe there'll be bumblebees that are just under that leaf litter, and that will make an important difference for them. I just see a question there. How deep down is in the nest when they're in burrows? And this really depends on the whatever nest that the rodent made that they're using. So these nests can be just a few inches down. There was a nest we dug up a few years ago that was 5 feet down. So it really just depends on where that rodent, the mouse or the vole, how were they going down this way? Were they going around this way? They can really follow a lot of different kind of patterns.
I think maybe we should move on to the next section. There's a lot of questions here that are sort of related to threats and conservation, and maybe we'll help answer some of those questions as we go ahead and get started. Leif, when you're presenting for me, just for some logistics here in front of the group, I'm getting a notification that your bandwidth is low. So while you present, I might recommend that you turn your camera off just to save that bandwidth for your audio.
Will do. All right. Great. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, hopefully successfully here. Rich or Katie or Elaine, can you give me a thumbs up if you see just one slide, just the title slide? Great. Okay, thank you. So I'll now be kicking off our second half of this webinar, which is on bumblebee threats and conservation. So basically, why are some bees declining? And after we go through that, Rich will talk to you about some of the things that you can do to help. And Elise will also talk about the Bumblebee Atlases. So yes, a number of our bumblebee species turn out to be in decline. And this is a concern for us, obviously, because we are talking about native insects that belong on the landscape and are co-evolved with native plants and are part of the ecosystems around us. But of course, we care about this because bumblebees are economically valuable to us as well. That is, that wild bees frequently come to farms and forage for nectar and pollen, and in so doing, they pollinate our crops. So this is a really substantial piece of economic benefit that we get from nature that we don't get when these bees start to become less common. What you're seeing on the screen here is 4 species that have declined, and they all happen to be closely related to each other. They're all in the same subgenus of the genus Bombus. And we think there may be something to that in terms of the signature of their decline. From left to right, it's the Western bumblebee, or Bombus occidentalis, found broadly in the Western US and Canada. Franklin's bumblebee, found in a very narrow range in California and Oregon, Bombus franklini. Bombus terricola, or the yellow-banded bumblebee, found mostly in the northeast of the US and in adjacent Canada, and then northwestwards towards Alaska, but not all the way there in the range. And then the rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis, which is the one that is found broadly in the northern Midwest, and with scattered populations remaining in the Allegheny Mountains. So there are other species that are of conservation concern, which we will get into here. But first, I'd like to ask the question, how do we know what the status of a bumblebee is? How do we know if something's declining? Well, generally, we try to compare historic status to current status. With bees, this is a challenge because we weren't paying attention 50 years ago or 75 years ago in the way we now are. And we don't have the data from those time periods to accurately depict the historic condition of the bees, or the status of the bees at that time. We're doing the best we can with the data that we do have. And I'm going to talk you through some of the status assessments that have been done by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN. And it's this bumblebee specialist group that some of us on the webinar are a part of. Rich led the publication of a status assessment for most of the North American species about 10 years ago. And we're going to talk some about that. So this status assessment involved comparing older records of bumblebees to modern or recent records of bumblebees, doing some geography and thinking about changes in range shape, changes in abundance over time, or at least abundance as estimated from that data from museums and other kinds of collections. This is what we found. This is what the IUCN analysis found. Fully a quarter of the species of bumblebees that are native to North America are in one of the categories of imperilment, which are depicted here in yellow, orange, red, and darker red, going from near threatened to critically endangered. So near threatened bees are going to be definitely in decline to some extent, but not right on the brink of extinction. Whereas those in the dark red critically endangered category, we may be talking about extinction, or we may have not seen the bee in 20 years, and thus we may suspect potentially extinction. 25% is a large fraction of a group of organisms to be under threat. And I want you to also notice the gray pie chart slice here, which is the number of the species for which we didn't have enough good data to even make the call. So 5 of roughly 50 species is 10%. That's a good deal, a good number of those species where we can't really say what's going on. And so potentially the number of species that are, or the proportion that are in decline in North America is higher, more like 35%. We will eventually have the answers here, but as of when we did this assessment, we're not positive about those data deficient species. Let's take a look at the names of some of those species that are in those 4 categories of imperilment with the IUCN. So Xerces Society works with the IUCN. This is that study done by Rich, and I was a co-author on it also, to assess all of these bees in North, Central, and South America. And in the Western United States, we have 8 species that are on the list, if you will, of bees that are at least vulnerable. The most endangered of these is Bombus franklini, which I already showed you a photo of. That one we haven't seen since 2006, despite our efforts to find it. Most years somebody has been out looking for it, including last year, when the bee was actually listed as federally endangered. So I'm optimistic that the listing will bring a lot more attention and funding to searches for this bee, and that we will still be able to find a population. But as of now, that bee is missing in action. The next one, Suckley's bumblebee, is broadly distributed in northern, northwestern North America, and historically only was found in northernmost California and parts farther north in montane places. But that one is more or less missing from the Western United States, and still found farther north, but is definitely a concern. Crotch's bumblebee is one that's nearly endemic to California and has we've seen strong range contraction range change and apparently a loss of abundance. The obscure bumblebee is a similar story where we're seeing less of that bee than we used to. Morrison's bumblebee is found broadly around the West. It is still found broadly around the West, although we find it a lot less often than we used to in our collections work, and we think that means that there are fewer of them out there. The Western bumblebee is still found throughout montane parts of the West, but its range has contracted. In addition to mountainous range areas, it used to occur on the Pacific coast and from about San Francisco north. And we're no longer finding it in coastal locations whatsoever. So we don't really know what's happened to this bee. We have some strong guesses, but that one, it's really a strong concern that we're losing that bee in the Western United States. American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus, is another one that is found much more broadly coast to coast. And we think that one's vulnerable to decline. And then Bombus fervidus, the one that we said was a more aggressive bee, is also reported to be in decline, at least in the east, and it's a little bit uncertain about what's going on the West Coast. Here's a rundown of those species in the east that are in trouble. Everybody's probably heard about the rusty patch bumblebee. This is the first bumblebee that was listed by the federally endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That happened in 2017. And that's a species that was probably the most common bumblebee in the eastern US, at least in the northern eastern US, until the 1990s, when it suffered a precipitous decline. It just disappeared from one year to the next in many field sites, many locations. Now, I can vividly remember biologists conferring with each other and saying, hey, I can't find that bee this year. It's just missing. And that became a true story over the years, where it very abruptly declined. And is now found mostly in the northern Midwest, but also we have some scattered populations holding on in Virginia, West Virginia, and perhaps some other mid-Atlantic states. We also have Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee on the East Coast, just barely in the United States, but also in Canada, in the Eastern Maritime provinces. Variable cuckoo bumblebee, this one we haven't seen in nearly 20 years. Actually, I should say more than 20 years. I think 2000 or 2001 is the last record. This bee was broadly distributed across the southern and central part of the United States, and is a obligate host parasite, social parasite of the American bumblebee. So the host still is found broadly in the US, but this parasite, the social parasite or cuckoo bumblebee, is no longer being found, and we're really concerned about that one. Southern Plains bumblebee is widely distributed in the Great Plains in the Midwest, but is definitely in trouble, is declining. And then we have the Bombus fervidus again, and Bombus pennsylvanicus again. Those both have eastern distributions. And then we have this one called yellow-banded bumblebee, which is found in the northern New England, adjacent Canada, and in a northwestern band going towards northern British Columbia. So we have a number of species in both the West and the East in this country that are of conservation concern. So I'm just going to show you one from each coast, if you will, to get a little deeper here. The rusty patch bumblebee, as I said, was listed in 2017. What does listing mean? What are the implications of that? Well, the federal government stepped in and said this animal is at risk of extinction, and we're going to protect remaining populations through this law. There's always a question with federal listing of whether the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will choose to designate critical habitat. Capital C, capital H, critical habitat is something that's described and defined in the law, and it's geographic areas that are designated by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as places where we'll protect habitat for those species, and we may require certain kinds of environmental review that we wouldn't elsewhere. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided not to designate critical habitat for this species, possibly because of its tendency to live around people in suburban places, even in urban places. It's as well as in more natural areas, but it is difficult to figure out how we would designate critical habitat for the species. We do have this this analogous system called high potential zones that the service is using to protect this bee. So those are buffers around of the bee. So if I saw the bee in 2022 someplace, then in 2023, the Fish and Wildlife Service would have a polygon, a buffer around that point in which it would require certain kinds of environmental review to protect that population that must be there. So there's some other stuff on the side about what listing has meant for this bee. But generally speaking, this bee has benefited greatly from listing. It's brought a ton of new attention. It's brought lots of funding for more research, and we're learning more about the causes and consequences of decline for this species. Franklin's bumblebee was just listed in 2022, as I said. This is a very different condition. This bee has a very small home range, and almost all of it is mountainous protected land. It's mostly national forest land in Northern California and Southern Oregon. So we don't have as many problems with or questions about pesticides and agriculture or habitat conversion for urbanization or those kinds of things. Nonetheless, the service it looks like they're going to designate high potential zones for this species as well, as opposed to habitat. It's early days yet, so we may see some changes to that. But similar to the rusty patch bumblebee, with listing of Franklin's bumblebee comes lots of attention and resources to help us conserve the bee. So people in and out of government are actively working on finding, relocating populations of this species. I'll now talk about the reasons for some of these declines. What are the threats that are taking place that are causing bumblebee declines? This is a great paper about insect decline in general, and it's a graph from that, an image from that paper. The idea here is death by 1,000 cuts. There are many different drivers of insect declines around the world. Here in blue boxes, I'm just calling out the 4 big categories for bumblebees. So those include habitat loss through conversion of land to agriculture or to living spaces for humans, or transportation corridors, et cetera. Climate change, pathogens, which are spread between bees, often at flowers, and then pesticide exposure. So we'll go through each of those 4 categories, and I'll give you some more detail about these. Just so you understand, for other insects, there are a number of other drivers of decline, like nitrification, other sorts of pollution, all sorts of other things, invasive plant species, invasive species of all sorts. But these are the 4 big ones for bumblebees. And it's usually not just one threat, it's usually a combination of factors that's driving these declines. So first, habitat loss. We're losing habitats like this one, which I think is an intact grassland in the Midwest. I'm not positive of the location, but you can see native plants here, a lupin or perhaps a baptisia. And this is just fantastic bumblebee habitat. I see nesting habitat along the edge of this prairie that are digging holes and providing nesting habitat and so on. We're converting habitats like that to habitats like this. Here's a farm field, row crop agriculture, perhaps for soybeans or corn. There are habitat values to agricultural lands for bumblebees, but modern industrial strength agriculture has removed many of those in service of increasing yield and profits. So, for example, many of the crops that we grow are genetically modified to be resistant to herbicides, so that we can apply herbicides to the growing plants to kill their competitor plants, but not the target plant itself. This removes a lot of flowering material from agricultural lands and leaves sterile places like this where bumblebees generally don't find a lot of food to eat and also find a lot of risk in terms of being exposed to insecticides and other anthropogenic threats. Here's a comparison of 2 different studies that lend credence to this idea that we're losing habitat. On the left, you see in the period from 2008 to 2012, we've had a net cropland increase of almost 3 million acres of land. So we're building out more and more farmlands as we go here in the United States. A lot of that was grasslands converted to croplands. By contrast, and from a second unrelated study, we see that mean bee abundance has declined precipitously, and especially in those areas where grassland conversion to cropland took place. So this is not a causal relationship from two disparate studies, but it's really strong evidence that this pattern is happening. And there's a lot of other evidence that habitat loss is a significant driver of decline for bumblebees. Next, we'll turn to pesticides. And here I want to say I'm not just talking about insecticides, which are designed to kill insects. We're also talking about fungicides. We're also talking about herbicides in some cases. And importantly, we're talking about mixtures of these chemicals. As an example here, we have one neonicotinoid called imidacloprid. And I'm showing 3 maps that show you the growth in use of this chemical over time. It came on the market in the early 1990s and was a little bit slow to be adopted, but it became extremely popular with US farmers. And as of 2012, large areas of the Midwest were seeing application of this compound every season in agricultural lands. This is a chemical that's often applied to seeds, and the reason for that is that the chemical is systemic in plants. Plants suck up the toxin and then translocate it to all parts of their body, if you will, including nectar and pollen. And so bees become exposed to this chemical, not because it's sprayed on top of them generally, but because it's inside the plant that they forage on, that they depend on for their food. The exposure to this is often sublethal, but we do see really pervasive negative impacts of this and other pesticides when applied to crops that bees are foraging on. You might think from what I've just said that agriculture is the culprit here. And if we have to point fingers, agriculture is a culprit where pesticide use is concerned. But I hope this graph will convince you that it's not only farmers who are applying insecticides and other chemicals. For insecticides, a substantial amount of the application nationwide is actually from home and garden use, so backyard use. And there's a really big difference between farmers applying pesticides and the rest of us applying pesticides. Farmers have to take a class and pass a test before they can be certified pesticide applicators. And they generally know something about the process that your average Home Depot or Lowe's shopper is not going to know. So it's just important for us to understand that this problem of pesticide exposure for bees is one that takes place on farms, but significantly takes place away from farms as well. We're really limited in what we can do to research this question because the United States does collect pesticide usage data, but it purposefully does not collect very detailed pesticide usage data. And especially for the seed treatments, we just don't know very much about how much is being used and where. So we're trying to get better at this, but there are significant uncertainties around pesticide use. How do bees actually become exposed, though? I told you that systemic contact is possible, and in these 5 pictures on the above right, you see systemic contact. So we spray this chemical on the ground, or we coat a seed with it. The plant takes it up and then expresses it in the flower. Obviously, the most important way that insects can become exposed to pesticides is direct contact. So if you spray over the top of the crop while the bee is foraging, you're going to wet the bee with the product, and that's probably the strongest way to become exposed. There is indirect contact, for example, when sprays take place at night and then bees forage the following day. Even when bees stand on foliage, they can sometimes become exposed to significant quantities of pesticides applied to the plant. Regulators at the EPA and elsewhere have not considered other means of exposure until recently. So for example, there's a whole series of bees that cut little pieces of leaves off of plants. They bring that home and they use that to close up their nest. These are not bumblebees, they're other types of wild bees. And so obviously they become exposed to systemic pesticides when they chew on leaves, but we tend not to think of bees as herbivores in that sense. And so we've ignored this until recently. And then a significant source of exposure for bees has got to be contamination in the nest, since most bees nest underground in contact with dirt, and agricultural plants generally grow in dirt. So this is a major oversight to date by regulators to think about those exposure routes. And for bumblebees, we should definitely think about the majority of 4 of the 5 of these exposure scenarios. So around the world, we see problems with disease driving bumblebee declines. And this is a case where in some cases, we are certain that the diseases are driving the declines. And we often see this happen after the import of bumblebees from another continent or country to the agricultural system of the focal community. So in South America, in Chile and Argentina, we have this beautiful large bumblebee called Bombus dalbami, that orange bee in the bottom. That bee is being driven to dangerously low population levels. And the reason is some invasive bumblebee species that were imported for agriculture, plus the pathogens that they brought with them. And so they are spreading those pathogens to that bee through shared use of flowers. And so it's both a competition and a disease transmission that's causing the problems for that bee. We're less certain about some of the other links between disease and bee declines, but we do see a signature of that for the rusty patched and perhaps for the Western bumblebee. So this, the fact that we have a commercial pollination industry that uses bumblebees is, on the one hand, it's a really wonderful development in agriculture. It allows us to grow more food in more kinds of ways than we could before, but it comes with significant risks that we humans are not managing adequately. So we're moving bee diseases all over the world through this industry. So the bees come in a little box like this box on the left-hand side in the image. There's very little regulation in the US and in most of the rest of the world. So you can, in many places, you can buy a bee that is not native to the area, and then that's it. It's up to you what you do with it. If people choose to put those bees outdoors, they may spread diseases to wild bees, and they may become naturalized. They may leave the nest and successfully hibernate and then reproduce on the landscape the next year. So this is a very valuable part of US agriculture, but it comes with significant risks that, as I said before, we are not adequately managing as we move these things between countries and between states with little or no regulatory oversight. I should say some things about honeybees here also. It's not only bumblebees that are causing this transmission of diseases from commercial to wild bumblebees. We also see honeybees playing a role in disease transmission to wild bees, including bumblebees. And this is really concerning because honeybees are so ubiquitous. We use them in agriculture as the main pollinator for so many crops. But we also see honeybees broadly used in backyard beekeeping and for honey production and the production of other hive products. But we see honeybees naturalizing throughout the continent, not everywhere, but in many places. And honeybees often are sold with certain diseases that really we can't treat for, especially viruses. And so we do see that when honeybees are close to wild bees, or the other way around, really, the wild bees tend to have higher disease loads, which is what these graphs are showing. Generally, more parasite species for bumblebees close to apiaries, and this one particular disease called Cryphidia bombi was higher in the bumblebees when they lived near to an apiary as opposed to far away. So honeybees are important to us and they're valuable in all kinds of ways, but we really need to stop thinking about them as part of the ecosystem, and we need to think about them as part of our agricultural economy and try to keep them out of ecosystems where they may not belong. This disease transmission is really complicated and can happen in different ways. The most simple way is what we call spillover. So pathogen spillover, where one organism passes a disease to another organism. And so generally a commercial bee nest, either honeybees or bumblebees, a bee will forage on a flower, leave its diseases, and then wild bees will forage on the same flower and pick up those diseases. We also see facilitation where diseases might get going in wild bees because of negative impacts they are experiencing from competition or other factors associated with managed bees. And then we definitely know that there is spillback. So even if commercial bees are responsible for spreading some diseases to wild populations, we know that those wild populations can then become a reservoir for disease, and then they can reinfect the commercial bees in successive years. So this is a problem where negative impacts flow both directions. And it's a serious problem we need to get a handle on to conserve wild bees, but also if we care about the success of agriculture and beekeeping, we need to do a better job of managing those diseases. One more thing about honeybees, in addition to disease spread, they can have a strong negative impact on native bees through competition for resources. Bees are not out there on the landscape fighting for nectar and pollen. They are just out there feeding as fast as they can. And honeybee hives are very good at extracting pollen and nectar from the landscape. So just one honeybee hive can have a really strong impact on the local environment. They can cause lower success for wild bees in their foraging for nectar and pollen, as these graphs demonstrate. They can also cause lower densities of native bees in areas near apiaries. There's this one statistic that I find really wild. A single honeybee hive over the course of a growing season, its pollen needs are equivalent to that of about 100,000 larvae of solitary bees, of wild bees. So that's an awful lot of wild bees that we're displacing by being backyard beekeepers, or by placing commercial honeybee hives in wildlands so they have healthy forage when they're not pollinating crops, as is so often the case. So we really need to think about honeybees as farm animals and treat them as such, and consider that when we put them in wild lands or up against places where they interact with wild bees, there are some negative consequences. What about climate change? Well, climate change is obviously a huge problem, and it is having a pretty pervasive effect on bumblebees. One thing we see that bees are, populations are blinking out in the hottest places that a species might occur in, but they're failing to move northward. So there's a net effect of a constriction of their range to smaller areas. Climate warming is also driving them upslope, up in elevation. The degree to which this is happening is interacting with vegetation cover types in mountainous areas. We also see a really big change in the phenology, or the timing, of bumblebee life history events due to climate change. So bees are out much earlier than they used to be, and so are their host plants. In many cases that have been reported, both the bee and the plant have regressed to an earlier spring emergence time in a sort of a similar way. So the bee does find its food, but there are some studies that find that there's a mismatch in the phenological shift that's in response to warming. And in that case, pollinators are really strongly negatively impacted by climate change, in that they can't find the food that they need. There are obvious consequences for plants also. I'm almost done, and I'm going to turn it over to Rich, but we just have a few slides on uncertainty in bees that I want to get through here. So with pesticides, there's still a lot of uncertainty. As I alluded to earlier, this is partly because of our regulatory system, which doesn't fully protect wild bees from pesticide exposure. So before allowing a pesticide to go to market, the EPA will test, or will require that the product is tested on honeybees. And honeybees are used as a surrogate for all of the other bees. Their life history is very different from that of a bumblebee, or especially a solitary bee. And so honeybees are not great surrogates in terms of understanding what is going on for bees in exposure to pesticide scenarios. So we need data on other bees, and this graph does present some data from studies that involve bumblebees and honeybees, and in one case, a mason bee. But we really have very little information about how pesticides affect non-apis bees, bees that are not honeybees. We also, as I said earlier, we see these synergisms between different chemicals, making them much worse for the bee than if the bee consumed each of the two constituent things separately. And that's not part of the regulatory framework at this point. And so we don't, the EPA does not consider whether chemicals are mixing on the landscape or in the tank at the farm when they actually are. So we really need to do a better job at figuring out how pesticides are affecting bees. And then with disease, we have a lot of uncertainty. It's hard to look back in time and ask the question, what was disease prevalence in bees 20 years ago? This graph comes from a paper that did just that. They looked at museum specimens, and they actually sequenced the DNA of the specimens and recovered the DNA of the pathogen. And so I think the circle size here is sample size. And what I want you to see is that for 3 of these 4 tiles here, in the 1990s, the curve takes off and goes upward. And the idea here is that the bees had higher disease load in the 1990s and going forward than they did before. And the exception here is the lower right-hand corner Bombus terricola, where that wasn't the case. This is this is strong ancillary evidence that disease plays a role in declines, given that these three species are of conservation concern. But this is not mechanistic evidence that disease is causing population declines, and we really need more of that. So just to summarize, the threats for bees, we have pesticides, threats to both native bees and honeybees, habitat loss through development of lands for agriculture and human habitation and more, climate change in terms of warming, which I talked about a bunch, but also in terms of changes in precipitation and drought and fire regimes, and then pathogens and disease. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rich, who will talk about our efforts to address these declines.
Thank you very much, Leif. Elaine, you're much better at talking and clicking at once than I was. Before I get started, just want to briefly introduce myself. My name is Rich Hatfield. I'm a senior conservation biologist for the Xerces Society. I'm based at our mothership here in Portland, Oregon, and direct our bumblebee conservation programs. So I've been the sort of on-the-ground coordinator of the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas project, but I also am lucky enough to have my fingers in all of these other Atlas projects that are ongoing across the country, and just feel remarkably pleased and proud to be able to collaborate with such an amazing group of bumblebee conservation scientists, and really lucky for you all to be here, hopefully getting all this information from the Bumblebee Dream Team. So just thanks for being here today, and what a great experience for all of us. So thanks so much. I'm going to try to get through this information relatively quickly because we wanted to wrap up with some information about our Atlas projects, and then also have some time for Q&A. So there's a lot here. I may talk a little quickly, but bear with me. So I let Leif have the daunted task of depressing you all and sharing all of the threats and status of bumblebees. But I think one of the great things about pollinator conservation, with bumblebee conservation specifically in mind, is that we can all do something about this. All of the threats that Leif described are mostly man-made issues or person-made issues, which means that if we can change our behavior as human beings and do things differently, we can do a better job of conserving these animals. The goals are in our reach. We're still within a sort of build it and they will come scenario, where if we can do the right things on the landscape, we can help these animals recover and repopulate their former ranges. So what I'm going to talk about briefly here is Xerces conservation approach. And it's not just Xerces, there's a lot of partners that are working on this as well, but we're really thinking about three things. One of these is, how do we improve existing data sets? And this is a lot of what our Atlas projects are trying to achieve. We need to focus then on habitat. While we learn more about these animals and their specific needs, we really need to start building habitat. And then third, we need to recognize that bumblebee habitat, as hopefully you've now learned, goes well beyond just flowers on the ground. We also need to think significantly about overwintering and nesting habitat, and how we also put that habitat on the ground and protect that habitat, because just putting flowers on the ground is likely not going to be enough. So starting with this question of baseline data sets, it would be hard to teach a bumblebee conservation workshop in North America without mentioning Robin Thorpe, who is the individual on the screen here. He was based at UC Davis in California, and I think was a mentor to most of us on this webinar. He was certainly a great mentor and friend to me, and I spent many hours in the field with him and was a great teacher for me. But it was really his work in Northern California and Southern Oregon, monitoring the populations there, that led to sort of many of us raising the red flag about bumblebee conservation in the late 1990s. So having these baseline data sets are absolutely essential for keeping a finger on the pulse of these animals, and making sure that we can institute on-the-ground conservation if and when it's needed. And I hate to think what would have happened if Robin hadn't been monitoring the Western bumblebee and Franklin's bumblebee in the Western United States, where we might be now with bumblebee conservation if we weren't able to launch what we were. So that's the goal of a lot of our Atlas projects, is to build these comprehensive conservation databases so that we can keep tabs on these animals moving forward. And we're doing that a number of different ways. Our Atlas project is one way. You can also just contribute by sharing observations on iNaturalist or on Bumble Bee Watch. And basically you can do this anywhere, which is just to go out and take a picture of a bumblebee on a flower. And then you can go to bumblebeewatch.org and upload that photo and use our interactive identification guide. And then one of our experts, which are most of the people on this webinar, will go in and actually look at your photo and verify your observation, or change the species name if we need to. We also have our Bumblebee Atlas projects, which are now active in 15 states across the United States. You can learn more about these projects at bumblebeeatlas.org. We obviously have a number of partners. Xerces is a lead partner on all of these, but there are many other partners involved, and just want to acknowledge them at least through their logos on this slide, and recognize they don't have time really to name all of them, but really couldn't do this work without their help. And then so that's sort of the idea of building up our databases. The next phase, if you remember, was putting habitat on the ground. And habitat means 4 things. We do need to put flowers in the ground that are not laden with pesticides, that are active from early spring through late fall. We need to create shelter. So we need to protect nesting and overwintering sites. And then we need to work on connecting these habitats in space. So we need to give animals a chance to find other populations and corridors for them to move through. So we need to be building habitat, not just at a local small scale, but also at a regional scale, so that we can have these habitats connected and grow and allow populations to healthily reproduce. And then really need to reduce the use of insecticides on the landscape. These toxic insecticides that Leif mentioned in his section just really have no place in ornamental settings. We can have a separate conversation about farms where there's an economic threshold, but at homes, where there's no economic threshold, the use of some of these highly toxic insecticides is not making the world a better place. And so what does this mean for how do we put flower resources on the ground? How do we put nesting resources on the ground? How do we work as a community to connect these habitats? And while reducing pesticides, hopefully that's pretty clear. But yeah, when we build a garden for bumblebees and other pollinators, we want to focus on having early plants in the middle of the summer that are blooming, and then plants in the late season. So we really want to create a system, a plan that has many different colors and sizes and shapes throughout the whole course of the year. And oftentimes early season and late season are the keys. Those are the times when queens are sort of in their solitary phase of when they're emerging, and they're the only animal representing their colony. So they need those early season resources to start their colony. And then they need those late season resources to build up their fat reserves so that they can make it through the winter. And in the early season, we really want to focus on shrubs and trees. They're often some of the best early season flowering resources that we can put in our yards and gardens. And then late season, things like asters and goldenrods are plants that are where you'd have native plants likely in your area, and those genera or those groups of plants that you could put into your landscapes. I'm going to skip this poll question just in the nature of time. The question was, are all flowers good for bees? A lot of people think that any flower probably has benefit no matter where you put it. But the reality is that there are many species that are not. A lot of horticultural and garden varieties have been bred purely for looks, and they've actually lost the functional parts of their flowers. They no longer have anthers, so they're not carrying pollen, or that pollen really isn't available or doesn't have much nutritional component to it. And many of times they don't have nectar. So there's no attractiveness to bees or bumblebees here. And so we really want to avoid these garden varietals like pansies and other things that sometimes you see in commercial landscapes. If we can shift away from those plants to functional native plants or even functional garden plants, we're going to be in a much better place just from the start. But these highly varietal, double petaled, quadruple petaled varieties don't have any benefit to bumblebees or other pollinators. So again, we want to focus on these plants in the early spring. This is a very vulnerable time for queens, and flowering trees and shrubs is a great way to do this. And then also focusing later in the fall, putting goldenrods out there and some of these later blooming plants to allow our queens to build up their fat reserves to make it through the winter. A number of years ago, I wrote this book called Conserving Bumblebees that talks about managing lands basically at any scale. It outlines the threats that Leif discussed and talks about clear management goals and best management practices in here. So if one of my co-panelists would drop a link to this in the chat so folks could take a look at it, that will allow me to sort of zoom through these plant lists that I've put in the slideshow here, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about here today. We're also, in addition to sort of putting land management guidance out there for folks to look at a national scale, we're now using data from our Atlas projects to build these statewide conservation plans. We recently released this strategy to protect state and federally recognized bumblebee species of conservation concern for the state of Washington. And this covers geographic priority areas for conservation efforts. It has management recommendations. It talks about priority actions and also about research opportunities and how to mediate threats. And we hope to continue to use data from our Atlas projects to build these as our program expands nationally. These are the plant lists that are available in that Conserving Bumblebees guidebook that hopefully you now has a link to. Just in the nature of time here, I'm going to zoom through these and not spend a lot of time talking about the individual plants. But you can see that we have these for each region. We focus on different colors, having plants that are blooming through the year. And these are all plants that are sort of evidence-based that we know are preferred by bumblebees in different regions of the country. So I would encourage you to take a look at these and to find relevant plants for your landscape should you have that space available to you and are interested in putting plants in the ground for bumblebees. And again, we want to focus on not just flowering plants, but also on overwintering and nesting sites. And this is basically your opportunity to be lazy in your garden. Stop raking leaves. Leave areas of your yard unmowed. Leave brush piles around. Leave compost piles around. All of these things are great for bumblebees. They're great for butterflies. They're great for moths. They're great for all kinds of pollinators and beneficial insects. You can buy a pollinator habitat sign and put it right next to there, hopefully helping your neighbors understand that you're not being lazy, but you're actually contributing to a functional ecosystem. This is really, really, really important. And then again, we want to work in our communities to put these landscapes together, use rights of way along rivers and power lines and roadsides to connect these areas and work as a community, not just as an individual in our yards, but actually work as a community to do this at scale so that bumblebees can move through the landscape and effectively reproduce. So again, we need to be putting habitat in everywhere that we possibly can. You know, in the margins of city parks, we could be putting habitat. On your porch, on a third-story building, you could put pollinator habitat and it will contribute. It truly is a build it and they will come scenario. We have a ton of resources on the Xerces website that can help you to do all of this. I said this before, I'll just say it quickly again. Toxic insecticides have no place in ornamental landscapes. We shouldn't be using them at home. There are other alternatives. Xerces has resources to help you with this. There are also master gardeners and other resources like extension offices. I'm sure Elaine's office in Minnesota has great recommendations for reducing the use of insecticides. So please use those resources in your community. The Xerces Society approach to any gardening is to examine the system. If you're having a problem with pests, it means that you probably put a plant there that doesn't belong, or it's too wet, or it's too dry. And so thinking about the system and thinking about what plants or different components you can add that will actually bring in the beneficial insects and the other plants that are needed to actually build an ecosystem. Ecosystems function without the need for chemical inputs. You can have fun building that ecosystem in your backyard or in your front yard. And then finally here, Leif mentioned the threat of managed bees on bumblebees. And I think the take-home message for us here is that honeybees are fascinating, great creatures, and there are good reasons to be a honeybee keeper, including, learning from them and education and getting honey and all of those wonderful things that come with them. They're truly beautiful animals. But when you are a beekeeper, you are not practicing conservation. You are practicing animal husbandry, right? It's like having chickens in your backyard. We don't encourage folks to have chickens in their backyard to solve the ongoing bird flu right now. That is not a recommendation, right? So we're not going to have the same thing to have folks solve the honeybee issue by putting honeybees in your backyard. It's not going to solve the problem, and it may also threaten our native bee species by competing with them and by transferring diseases. So we're okay with you becoming a beekeeper, but just making sure that you're doing this for the right reason. You're doing it because you want to be a beekeeper and you're in it for the long haul. You're not practicing bee conservation. Building habitat in your yard is practicing bee conservation. I'm going to turn it over to Elise there. Elise, I tried to go as fast as I could. I'm sorry. You're going to be a little short on time here, but you should be able to make it through and still give us a few moments for questions and answers. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's see here. Okay, so my name is Elise Bernstein. I work alongside Elaine at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. I help out with research and I do a lot of outreach and communication work. So I help to run the Minnesota Bumble Bee Atlas. So we're going to shift gears here, try to run through this pretty quickly, but we're going to talk briefly about some of the findings from the Bumble Bee Atlas and how the Bumble Bee Atlas is relevant for conservation. So community science works to gather data that we require to inform conservation actions. So over many years, our community scientists or our team of volunteers have detected rare bumblebee species in places that more professional surveys were not able to detect them. So for example, community science efforts have significantly contributed to understandings of Bombus occidentalis, or the western bumblebee's distribution, especially along the West Coast. Here where I am in Minnesota, the presence of Bombus melanopygus, or the black-tailed bumblebee, was confirmed thanks to a Minnesota Bumblebee Atlas volunteer. And we have seen an explosion of bumblebee observations in recent years, thanks to high participation in Atlas projects across the country. This rise in observation started in 2018 with the launch of the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas project, and the amount of data has continued to grow as Bumblebee Atlas projects have joined in different parts of the country. And this is allowing our team of scientists to rapidly gather a lot more data about bumblebees. So since the Bumblebee Atlas's inception, we have seen changing patterns of data collection, and these changing patterns are helping us close previously existing gaps in data. So this shows how those gaps have changed as the new projects have come about, and we are hoping to see more data gaps close in 2023 with the launch of the new Southeast Bumblebee Atlas. So data that has been collected in the Atlas is turned into tools for land stewards, natural resource professionals, and conservationists who want to support bumblebees. So guidance produced this far includes identification guides, detailed species profiles, and habitat management recommendations for both Nebraska and the Pacific Northwest. So let's talk about some of these Atlas products just briefly. So in the Pacific Northwest, community scientists helped to gather data that fostered the publication of this summary and species accounts. And this publication includes gathered data points like plant lists, elevation charts, habitat types, phenology, and species distribution models. So since the launch of the Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas in 2019 and into 2021, 140 people conducted 525 bumblebee surveys. There were about 5,700 observations recorded during that time frame. Based on the data collected between 2019 and 2021, Nebraska scientists have developed a habitat management guide primarily designed for land managers, like those involved in the Bureau of Land Management or the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And this guide provides information on grazing, prescribed burning, mowing, invasive plant control, and pesticide use. So here's just a look at that Nebraska Habitat Management Guide, which also offers information on the top plants for bumblebees in the state of Nebraska, along with the top 10 most common bumblebees across the state. Also in Nebraska, data gathered by Bumble Bee Atlas volunteers helped to create this Nebraska Bumblebee Field Guide, which is a guide that has been created to suit varying skill levels and to be used in the field. The Nebraska Field Guide features 20 species profiles with ID features, illustrations, photos, range maps, and assorted biology and natural history notes. And it also contains really important information for the Bumblebee Atlas, like how to photograph bees and upload that data to Bumblebee Watch, the top bumblebee plants by ecoregion, mimicry, the external anatomy of a bee, and more. New records have been documented by participants in the Missouri Bumblebee Atlas, which was launched in 2020. 67 observations of Bombus fraternus, which is the Southern Plains bumblebee, were documented by 24 people across 15 counties since the Missouri Bumblebee Atlas's launch through 2022. So here in Minnesota, our bee survey started as the Minnesota Bee Atlas in 2016, but in 2021, Minnesota officially adopted Xerces Society protocols and launched our Minnesota Bumblebee Atlas. So these maps show a summary of some of the community science data points. The black marks on the map represent data from iNaturalist and Bumblebee Watch, and those dots are the ones from Bumblebee Watch, and the pink dots as well show where those surveys have been located. So from 5 years of surveys with equal effort across the state by community scientists, we can compare community structures of bumblebees throughout our state. So both of these species, Bombus impatiens and Bombus ternarius, occur throughout most of the state, but we know that impatiens are more common in the southern half of Minnesota, while ternarius are more common in the northern half of Minnesota. So as Leif mentioned earlier, the rusty patch bumblebee, or Bombus affinis, is one of bumblebee of conservation concern, which is also our Minnesota state bee. So this map is similar to the previous one, but shows the data for Bombus affinis. And these data are particularly useful for conservation concerned bumblebees, such as the rusty patched. So finally, our Minnesota Bumblebee Atlas volunteers also documented floral associations with bumblebees. Volunteers found the rusty patch bumblebee in particular on bee balm, goldenrod, culver's root, spotted knapweed, and red clover. And these plants were also commonly used by other bumblebees, with goldenrods, bee balm, and clovers being the top 3 plants that bumblebees were collected from across all of our Minnesota Atlas surveys. All right.
Awesome. We're just going to zoom through a last couple of slides here, just letting you know that the Xerces Society has a bunch of resources that are available for you, with this idea that putting habitat in the ground is the way to get started now, while we continue to build this evidence-based management guidance that Elise was just talking about in all of our Atlas projects. We have a number of books. You can see them here. They're available at libraries. They're available at national booksellers. You can find them, online. So feel free to take a look out for these great resources. Next slide, Elise. I also just put a link in the chat just a little while ago about our plant lists and other resource guides. We have a whole resource center that is available on our website, with just really a treasure trove of information out there available for all of you. I'll drop another link to our pollinator plant list, and you can navigate from there to our other resources. Next slide. And then just hope you'll follow us and network with us, using social media, either directly through the Atlas projects or through Xerces' other conservation programs. And we've got about 5 minutes left for question and answer. And just want to say, in case I don't get a chance to before some of you leave here, just thanks so much for joining us today. It really is a pleasure to see so many people interested in these programs and interested in conserving bumblebees. I started in bumblebee conservation over 25 years ago, and it would have been hard to get 20 people, I think, in a national webinar, and to be able to put this on in the middle of the day and a Saturday and have, close to 300 people join us is really remarkable. So thank you all so much for your time and everything that you all are doing on the landscape while we're working behind the scenes to help you. So thanks so much. And Laurie, I don't know if you've curated some questions for us, but we're happy to answer those questions as they come up. And again, thanks so much.
I think there's some questions in the Q&A that y'all have marked previously as potentially answering here.
Yeah, there was one question about human-made nest boxes for bumblebees that I wanted to talk about. And I'd love to hear thoughts from anybody else here, but I have had quite a bit of experience building these boxes. I put a bunch of them out during my graduate work. And I've had very, very little success getting occupancy in them. I think what we've learned over the years is what's inside of them is probably more important than the structure or the shape or the location of them. So building something on the inside that has the right insulation and materials for them to actually occupy, but then the odds of them actually finding them and using that, I think are very low. That said, they make great habitat features and increase conversations about pollinators and why nesting is important. So there are certainly good reasons to do this. I would say your chances of occupancy are probably 5%, if that. So you're very unlikely to be successful. That said, I've heard other people say that they're extremely successful doing this, but I've never had that success or seen it. So those are my thoughts about artificial domiciles and the effort it takes to build them and how much they actually contribute. I think by sort of being more messy around your yard and creating natural opportunities for rodents and brush piles are probably going to be more successful than actually building a nest. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means, well, you can decide based on that information.
Yeah, I totally agree with Rich. I just want to add in, I think, and I'd like to think since I've had, the similar rate of success and then hear about other people having a lot more success, I think there are just regional differences too with bumblebees in different parts of the world where there are species that are more amenable to using those artificial boxes in other places of the world. But also in the Midwest here, I've had very, very little luck. But lots of luck with natural habitat.
There was another question about cuckoo bumblebees. Oh, sorry, Leif, were you talking?
I was going to bring up the same question. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay.
About the cuckoo.
You're breaking up a bunch, so if you're going to talk again, maybe try to turn your video off again. Sorry about that. I'm sorry you're having troubles there. Yeah, so there's a question here about cuckoo bumblebees and why is it important if they're declining? There's many different ways to answer this question. For me, it's kind of emotional, and that any species that's out there, I think, deserves a chance to be out there, no matter what their ecological contribution is, or if they make any contribution to humans. So to me, like, the preserving of a species is a reason in and of itself to worry about its concern. But cuckoo bumblebees, they're probably ecologically within the bumblebee world. The way I've always thought about it is they're kind of like a predator. And we usually think about predators and predator-prey relationships as actually strengthening the stock of sort of the native bumblebees. So they may help bumblebees make better choices about where to build their nests or how to build their nests. And ultimately, we just get a strengthening of those social bumblebees through time. So there's certainly an important piece of the ecology and biology of sort of the community of bumblebees in any given area. They're also pollinators in their own right. They visit flowers. They don't collect pollen and move it around like our social true bumblebees do, but male cuckoo bumblebees can be quite abundant on certain species of flowers and are likely significant contributors to pollination there. certainly as much or more than monarch butterflies or another number of other species that we consider taxa. So they're a really important, component of bumblebee ecology, I guess would be my short answer. And I'd welcome contributions from any of you to add to that. I guess I covered it. Just a few note-keeping issues at the end here. There's been some questions about whether we could share the question and answer. We will have it saved. We'll also save the chat, and if there's anything relevant in there, we can certainly make sure to make those resources available to those of you that have participated today. If you're in one of our states with a Bumblebee Atlas project, whether you're new or old, we say welcome, and we really hope you'll join us and come to one of our workshops and events this spring. We're running a bunch of training events for all of our Atlas projects all throughout the country, and we really hope you'll join us at those webinars. If you can't make them, we have more online options. There's recorded options for training, and we just hope you'll continue to get interested and engaged. And if you live in a state that doesn't yet have an Atlas project, we encourage you to try to build a network of folks that are interested in launching one, and let's put the resources together and make it happen. There's no reason we can't expand this project more broadly than the 15 states we're already in, and really hope we're able to do that. So if anyone else has anything else to say, please hop in. Otherwise, I'll just say thank you all for being here, and thank you for this amazing group of presenters sharing such wonderful information today. So thanks so much.